What if we say to ourselves that we in the 21st century are in roughly the position that the Roman Empire was in the 3rd century? We're in a state of crisis. Right? And instead of assuming that we've got to find a way to stay the course or stick with the institutions we've got and protect them as long as we can, we say, well, the Roman Empire had to fragment for things to change. What would we have to give up? What would we have to do in order to shift the perspective and open up new frontiers? That's a question worth exploring, and that's where leadership is really important.
The fundamental question is that, can we repair something, the Roman Empire, or is it doomed to fragment and explode? Is Western civilization a Roman Empire that now needs to be blown apart by all of, identity politics and intersectionalisms and reparation? We just got to get rid of Western civilization because it's run its course like the Roman Empire. And I don't think that's what you're claiming, but I'm pushing the point a little bit further to be provocative. Or should we be fighting to identify the institutions that are now completely corrupt and get rid of those, but those that are working well, like here in France, the health system, the hospital system, the university-based hospital system here is underfunded, but incredible. It's still, amongst the best in the world in terms of the surgeons, immunotherapy. The techniques they have here are incredible, but of course it's state funded. If the state no longer existed, one of the first things to break down would be the schools and the hospitals. So what are your thoughts about getting the balance, blowing everything up, or trying to identify and save and improve the institutions that are worthwhile and get rid of all of the other things at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, that's, if I may say so, a very sweeping question. So it's hard to give a concise answer to it. But it's very clear that when the Roman Empire fell, a great deal that was good fell with it. And Alexis de Tocqueville says the same in l'Ancien Régime and Révolution, that there was certainly a need for reform and even radical change to the monarchy. But in the revolution, a lot was swept away that it actually would have been good to keep. And so it's difficult in the best case to know in advance what should go and what should be kept. And it's very difficult to arrange politically that you will get rid of what you want to get rid of, that you'll get agreement that it should go, and that you'll get agreement about preserving and succeed in preserving what's actually valuable. But the beauty of reflections like that of Tocqueville is that he, at least after the fact, thought about this and thought about it with a generosity and an imagination and an eloquence that makes his book a classic, right? We need people to read those things as they try to conceive. What are we trying to change and why? And what do we want to keep and build? That's one way perhaps to address your question. We know, going back to that parallel with the classical world, that Rome, for example, here's a microcosm of it. Rome, for half a century after the empire in the West fell, was still a very substantial city. At its height, in the first couple of centuries, it had 1 million inhabitants, which is staggering when you consider, the economy of the time. And a magnificent set of public buildings and aqueducts and, huge public baths and temples and so on. Much of that was still in place under the Gothic kings of Italy, particularly Theodoric, right? And he wanted to preserve those buildings. He appointed people to keep them going, and the aqueducts kept working. The city still had 500,000 people when Justinian decided, I want to take Italy back. By the time his generals, Belisarius and Narses, had finished retaking Italy from the Goths, Rome was a ghost town. The population had dropped to about 50,000. The aqueducts were broken, and they've never been repaired since. The temples were largely destroyed, and it was that Rome over which the papacy presided right through the Middle Ages and into the 19th century. And it was for that reason that Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century said that the Catholic Church, or the papacy at least, is the ghost of the Roman Empire and sits brooding upon the grave thereof. It's really almost Gothic language, you might say. Now, I mention that because in our science fiction scenarios, in our more somber imaginings, it is quite easy to conceive of things coming apart very severely in the 21st century. That doesn't necessarily mean the end of the species or the end of life on Earth. I don't buy into those scenarios, but it could mean really grave crises, large-scale loss of life, breakdown of fundamental humanities, And if that happens now, where the population of the world is far bigger than it was in the Roman Empire, and where in the most advanced countries you have rapidly aging populations, you have very large numbers of people dependent on government funding and medical services and welfare, then it's a god-awful mess that you're going to end up with, right? It's just awful to contemplate. So you can well imagine various public-spirited people saying, well, we've got to stop that happening. We've got to preserve that. And by their efforts to prevent a collapse of that system, they put more and more resources, even borrowing money, into simply keeping these structures going, when in fact there's a competition for resources. And if you want a new future, you're going to have to invest in that. There's a real dilemma.
Peace doesn't come by accident. Success doesn't come by accident. Cooperation doesn't come by accident. War does. Destruction does, out of doing nothing. Whereas if we want to continue to prosper as a kind, as a species, there are going to have to be strong efforts, and we're going to have to go out of our normal way to really make it happen. So question, is that a decent summary, fair summary? Am I twisting your arm? Am I leading the witness, or am I forgetting something?
No, I don't think that there'd be very many people who would disagree with the proposition that we have serious challenges, and that if we simply resort to conflict over them, we become part of the problem. We need to think and communicate. We need to listen actively. We need to innovate. We need to cooperate. The difficulty is operationalizing all of that. And, when one falls to being a scholar, an academic, often you spend a whole career mostly just trying to think that through, and it's genuinely complex and challenging, even to tackle a part of it and write a good work of history or a good work of philosophy or sociology. To step out of academia and say, well, for better or worse, I've learned enough that I think I've got my bearings, but I need to take action. I need to run a business or get into government or be an intelligence analyst and so on. Then you are in a different game. You're no longer just trying to get the words in the right order, or you're trying to make an effect. And it was George Shultz, when he was Secretary of State, as I recall, who said that he'd also, been in academia, and he said, you think differently if you're thinking towards a conclusion than you do if you're thinking towards action. So if we're having a conversation, if we're writing a dissertation, we're thinking towards a conclusion. If we're thinking towards action, then we're in a game theoretic context where once we act, that changes the environment, and other people will react in ways we can't either predetermine or even predict. And we will have to deal with that. And not just in conversation, in action. That's the world of politics. And that's where leadership has to say, this is not dissertation. We are in action. We're accountable and responsible, and there are consequences. And we have to keep dealing with those consequences. The world is not the way we might wish it to be. We can't, unilaterally make it the way we think it should be. And even to do that is going to generate more problems, not just necessarily solutions. It's endlessly complex. So one of the great virtues of a real leader is patience, And so I suppose what I would wrap up by saying is that insofar as we're at least running programs, and Clara and I talked about this when she created a leadership program in Venezuela, is that among the characteristics that you need to inculcate in people who at least aspire to be leaders or are trying to think about what leaders they admire is qualities of moral character, qualities of intelligence, qualities of courage, and fortitude. There was Kennedy who, before he became president, wrote a book called Profiles in Courage. And it wasn't necessarily about great figures in history. It was about individuals who just simply exhibited courage, principle, and integrity. We need that in bucket loads right now.